this session on the Sitecore ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK, which enables headless development for .NET Core on Sitecore 10. I'm Nick Wesselman, Product Manager for Developer Experience at Sitecore. I manage our headless rendering SDKs and a number of other developer tools. I've been working with Sitecore in some form for over 12 years, and I'm coming to you from my home office here in Asheville, North Carolina.
Hello, my name is Oleg Jytnik, and I'm from Sitecore Dnipro office, and I was working with this in Sitecore for over 12 years, and I'm former developer of the Habitat and SXA, and currently I'm technical lead on the Sitecore CLI and ASP.NET Core SDK and the GSS.
So today our agenda for you is pretty simple. We're going to go through an introduction to the ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK, talk about what's in it, how it works. Oleg will walk you through our Getting Started template and its use of the SDK. And we'll wrap up by talking about when and why you should make use of the ASP.NET Core SDK. So first up, let's take a little trip back in time to Sitecore 9.1, where we introduced Sitecore JavaScript services. And one of the main innovations here was the separation of layout and rendering through the Sitecore layout service. So whereas historically, Sitecore rendering was very much coupled with HTML coming directly out of our rendering engine embedded in a Sitecore delivery instance, the layout service was a new JSON-based service built on the same presentation layer, personalization engine, and item repository, but that outputs JSON instead of HTML. And in the output for that service, you have all the placeholders, components, and associated data sources for a Sitecore page. So this would allow you to render a Sitecore page outside of a Sitecore delivery instance. But given the complexity of this data, in particular the need to render a series of nested placeholders in a tree structure, you really need an SDK to be effective with it. And so for that SDK, or SDKs as it were, in Sitecore 9.1 we introduced JSS and SDKs for the React, Vue, and Angular frameworks. And again, those SDKs allowed you to consume layout service output as well as integrate with other Sitecore XP features like the experience editor and tracking and personalization and so on. So with Sitecore 10, in addition to JSS, we now have the ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK, which integrates through the same services and allows you to create an independently running ASP.NET Core application that we call a rendering host for rendering Sitecore content. If you're not familiar with ASP.NET Core, it will seem familiar in many of its concepts to ASP.NET Framework, but it is a redesign by Microsoft to be faster, more modular, more cloud and container ready, and of course to be cross-platform along with the rest of .NET Core. And it is open source, which can come in handy at times. The features we have in this SDK to enable you to integrate with the Sitecore platform include a client API for invoking the layout service, which can be used outside of ASP.NET Core if needed. What ASP.NET Core calls a tag helper for placeholder rendering and mapping to your components in ASP.NET Core. Additional tag helpers for rendering Sitecore fields, both various Sitecore field types, as well as the getting the support for WYSIWYG editing with the experience editor. The ability to map incoming HTTP requests to layout service requests, and bind the results of that layout service response to a strongly typed model that makes it easier to render. And then the ability to integrate with the Sitecore experience editor and analytics for full Sitecore XP support. Speaking of that HTTP request, let's talk through the request pipeline as it runs when using our rendering SDK. So the incoming HTTP request follows the usual ASP.NET Core process of resolving a controller and action. But at some point, we need to inject the Sitecore rendering engine middleware. And the typical way of doing that is to place an attribute on the controller action, which tells ASP.NET Core to add our middleware that will run before the action is invoked. And our middleware will make a request to the Sitecore layout service using values from the HTTP request, such as the incoming path. And the response, which comes back from the layout service, will then be placed in a rendering context in the ASP.NET Core HTTP context. And this data will be used later as we render placeholders and fields and so on. So from here, ASP.NET Core will invoke your controller action and begin to render your Razor view. And by using our placeholder tag helper in that view to render your root placeholders, you can then begin the process of rendering your full component tree. You can implement those components with partial views or view components or something we call model-bound views. And in the process, take advantage of our extensions to ASP.NET Core model binding to get values from the rendering context into a strongly typed model, and then pass those values into our tag helpers to render Sitecore content fields or render them values in other ways, ultimately creating that HTTP response that goes back to the user. So to make it easy to get started with our ASP.NET Core SDK, we have introduced a .NET New template with Sitecore 10 that includes not just use of the SDK, but all our new developer features with both containers and Sitecore content serialization. And following the instructions on our documentation site, it's pretty easy to get started installing the template and creating a new project. You do need to have .NET Core 3.1 and Docker for Windows installed in particular with Windows containers enabled. But with those prerequisites in place, you can get started in as little as 10 or 15 minutes. And with that, let's turn it over to Oleg to take a look at the Getting Started template and its use of ASP.NET Core rendering.
Hello and welcome to the Sitecore Symposium. And today we're going to present you how to build your application using the Sitecore Rendering Host SDK. The fastest way to start your journey with ASP.NET Rendering Host SDK is to use our Getting Started template. Template will create a solution with all necessary to build your own rendering engine-based application. You should start from the README file in the root of the solution. It will guide you through the process of getting and running the environment. There are more README files here and there, describes the different features of the solution. After completing environment preparation, you will get a set of Docker containers, which forms Sitecore XP environment with the rendering host application. Beside the Docker scripts, we have serialization items for the sample one-page application. During the environment setup, serialization is pushed to the Sitecore instance, but you can push and pull content at any time with the help of the Sitecore CLI. Next in the list is the MS Build project for deploying configuration and code into Sitecore content management role. In case you need to add custom config or extend the pipeline. And finally, we get to the rendering host project. So, rendering engine is the .NET Core SDK, which allows you to build ASP.NET Core rendering host for your Sitecore hosted content. And some configuration is required in order to use the SDK. First of all, you have to reference SDK libraries, which you can find on the official Sitecore Magit repository. So you're adding the reference to the project file. Most of the SDK libraries prefix it with the Sitecore SPNet prefix. After we're done with the reference, we can proceed with the configuration, most of which are done in the startup class of the application. There are other steps required to register SDK to the app, as for the most SPNet core applications. First is the service registration, and the second is the middleware registration. As we're going to consume content hosted in the Sitecore, we'll use new Sitecore layout service client to request data from the layout service API and return response using standard model. Layout service client configuration consists of two main parts. It's the client service registration and request handler configuration. So here is the layout service client service registration, and here's the handler registration. The multiple handles can be registered, so you can register that data from the multiple environments and even different configuration mechanism channels. Next on the way is rendering engine service registration. To add Sitecore rendering engine service to the DI container, we use an extension method that is returning the rendering engine builder, so you can configure additional features like Sitecore tracking or experience editor support. Rendering options allow you to map a component returned by the layout service with actual SPNet core view components or partial view. Add model bound view maps Sitecore layout component name to the default Sitecore view component, so ready view receives strongly typed model. And add default partial view maps any unmatched layout components to default partial view. And here we have some additional service registration to enable Sitecore robot detection. Let's proceed to the middleware registration. Here we have middleware for the header forwarding, for enabling the experience editor and endpoint, and request localization, and even robot detection middleware, but there is no evidence of rendering engine middleware. That's because rendering engine don't always need to be registered globally. It's useful in case there are pages where Sitecore content is not used. For these scenarios, middleware can be added on the individual MVC controller or action by the attribute. The main advantage of this approach is that overhead of executing the rendering engine middleware is removed from the pages that don't render Sitecore content. In our application, we wrote all requests to the default controller, which are executing Rendering Engine middleware, by applying the attribute to the action. And at this point, we already got response from the layout service through the layout service client, and bound content and layout service response properties to the model. In this case, we're using the attributes to bind model properties to the response fields. And let's have a look at the views. So we have the index view for the default controller. And Rendering Engine SDK provides several custom tech helpers for rendering Sitecore content, placeholder data, and metadata required for the page editing. The placeholder tech helper, which we have here, used to render components defined in a Sitecore placeholder. When the page is in edit mode, the tech helper renders editing home in editing in addition to the components. Other tech helpers can be found in the content block view, which is a razor view for the model bound component, which we saw in the startup class. So this view will be used for the content block components returned by the layout service. And in this particular case, we are using tech helpers. So we are passing the model fields to the SP4 attribute, and the tech helper renders content for you. And as a result of this effort, you'll get the sample one-page site with Sitecore Lady and experience editor support, which you can customize as you wish.
Thanks for that, Oleg. So as you can see, the ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK does very much work within standard ASP.NET Core mechanisms like service registration and middleware, all in your startup, and uses built-in ASP.NET Core features like razor views and model binding and view components. So, but you are probably asking yourself, hey, Sitecore has a lot of rendering options already. SXA, JSS, existing Sitecore MVC. So when should I use ASP.NET Core? And I would answer that by first saying that it would be in projects today where you would normally use what I call vanilla Sitecore MVC. So non-SXA projects with coupled MVC-based rendering. And this may be because you have a heavily customized front end or business logic, or maybe you don't otherwise benefit from the SXA features and workflow. So this would be one case where you might consider ASP.NET Core. Another use case might be projects where you were looking to get the headless rendering benefits of JSS, but maybe you don't have the JavaScript expertise, or you don't require the rich front end or SPA-like experience that you can get with the JavaScript frameworks. And so because you do get a degree of isolation with an ASP.NET Core rendering host and a bit more architectural freedom on the rendering side, that may be a scenario where you would want to use ASP.NET Core. And finally, if you or your customer has an existing ASP.NET Core-based site or application and you want to add in some Sitecore-based routes, then again, because we work within the ASP.NET Core framework, it's easy enough to add our middleware and services and necessary endpoints in order to add Sitecore-based routes to your existing ASP.NET Core site. So thank you very much for taking the time to find out about our ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK. We look forward to seeing your use and getting your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, Oleg, awesome, and everybody who came to watch. We are now into the live Q&A, where you get to try to get your answers answered by our experts here. We've got a lot of questions, not a lot of time, so we're going to jump right into it. And this is one of the most common questions we've seen, Nick. Do we need extra licensing to use this ASP.NET Core Rendering SDK?
So at this time, it is dependent on the same services as our JSS module, which does, at certain license levels, require an additional license purchase. It's something we're looking at in order to make it more available to more developers. But at this time, yes, it would require what we previously would call a JSS license.
Right. Now, the next question on a totally different angle was about the ASP.NET Core rendering piece itself. Does this mean that we can start doing Blazor?
So I've seen some experiments with it. At this time, what we support is server-side rendering with MVC, but we're very interested in Blazor and looking at possibilities there for how to best support it, especially as some advances come to Blazor and .NET 5. So as the product manager for this SDK, I'm very interested in hearing about your use cases and the customers who are interested in Blazor. So I think we'll provide some ways for you to get in touch to provide that feedback.
Now, another aspect of this is obviously we, as Sitecore, have been a big proponent of using Helix, guidelines to try to build out our projects. When we look at the ASP.NET Core rendering project that you've been showing, does this fit in well with those existing kind of framework projects that are out there, or are there some changes people have to watch out for? So you can most definitely build out an ASP.NET Core based solution following Helix guidelines. And in fact, if you go out to our Helix examples repository, you'll find one there. That's basically an extension of this getting started template. The getting started template is intentionally simple since it's meant as kind of a getting started training introduction means to these new features, these new developer features. But I would say definitely as you're building out in ASP.NET Core that you want to be following Helix guidelines. Yeah, and I think Rob Earlham, when he was building out the MVP side, he tried to do the same type of thing, following the same guidelines that you had there. Is how do we kind of deal with the feature level, the project level, and all that inside of an ASP.NET Core rendering app.
If anything, ASP.NET Core makes it easier to componentize your application. So
because it's nice and separated, yeah.
Yeah, and it's full SDK style projects and all that. So.
Now here's one. This might be for Oleg. I'm not sure. The demo was done using Visual Studio Code. Now, yes. We've stated the requirements are you need Visual Studio 2019. So if you don't have 2019, can you still do this? Like, what's going to work with this starter kit?
Actually, you can build the rendering host application by using the Visual Studio Code. So you're just using the .NET Commons for this purpose, and you don't necessarily need the Visual Studio 2019. But yeah, the Visual Studio will also work for you.
I think the getting started template needs Visual Studio because it does do a web application publish for that platform project. And that does, as I recall, require MS Build extensions that come with Visual Studio.
Right. So if you're doing your own project and you're not using that kind of functionality, you might be able to go with code. I know that for myself, I use Visual Studio because it's got a lot of other options in it that I'm used to. But okay, it's good to know about what's needed there. Now, here's an interesting question. We don't often talk roadmap, but this question comes in as like, the new .NET Core rendering SDK, when we're talking about this, and any other of the rendering options that are going to be built, and, you know, we saw the announcement where there's the Next.js one coming out as well. What is that with how we're looking at our SaaS future? Like, what's going to still be available at that time? Are we still going to have MVC? Are we still going to have SXA? But is there going to be something new? What are we looking at? How do we align here?
So SaaS is obviously a journey for us, but obviously in a SaaS world, you are going to be working with Sitecore in a headless way. So we did announce the XM delivery option in the product keynote, and one of the options for that would be using our ASP.NET Core SDK on top of that. We are looking to keep compatibility with these rendering SDKs as we go out to the cloud, but all standard legal disclaimers around the roadmap apply here. We subject to change.
Right. The future is uncertain, right?
Right.
You addressed this a little bit in the session around when should we use ASP.NET Core? The question here is like specifically around JSS versus ASP.NET Core. What would be the use case that you would say, I should choose the ASP.NET Core version?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, versus JSS. So if you've decided you want to develop headlessly and you're deciding between JSS and ASP.NET Core, I'd say that the first question is whether you actually want a spa-like user experience on your site, which obviously JavaScript is going to do that much better. Even with Blazor, even if we supported Blazor, you can probably get a much better experience with JavaScript given the Blazor payload size. The other consideration is obviously your level of JavaScript expertise and whether you're comfortable building out in that. So obviously there's a lot of .NET history in our partner network, so that was one of the main drivers in providing a headless .NET Core SDK.
All right, thanks, Nick. Now, we've only got time for one more question. So I'm going to have to choose between all the ones that are in here, but the one that I want to see is like, do we see that there are any gaps in the current Sitecore functionality that would happen if we chose .NET Core Rendering SDK versus doing something like Sitecore MVC, which has been around for a long time? Is there anything that you could only do in MVC, for example?
Sure. I'd say as far as just basic platform functionality, the Sitecore Forms is something we're still working on for ASP.NET Core, as well as some ability to call XP events in a headless way. JSS can do this, and you could use JSS packages to do that on the client, but there's no way to say trigger an event right now out of the box with our ASP.NET Core SDK. I'd say those are the two big ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
Oh, great. Well, thank you both. It's been great having you online. I hope everybody enjoyed. Obviously, you've shared some contact details during the presentation. Make sure to reach out, ask your questions. We're always available at any time. Hit us up on Slack, hit us up on Twitter.
Sitecore chat on Slack, and if you have any additional questions or have input on those Blazor use cases.
All righty, everybody. Thanks very much.
Yeah.